stop picking your nose.
All right.
Okay. So Scott is the owner of the Confluence Fly Shop here in Bellingham. He's going to be chatting with us a bit about Euro nymphing. Yeah, there you go, Scott. Thank you. You can see your screen. And Scott, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be able to do something for the chapter, and this is a subject that kind of unbeknownst to me earlier this year, I became very passionate about. Euro nymphing, and I'll get more into kind of what it is, how it's done, and some of the nuances of it. But Euro nymphing is something that I have heard about for years, or heard about check nymphing and things like that. And I thought, well, as a shop owner, I should probably at least know a little bit about this as people are coming in with questions and wanting to know what they need to make it happen. And so I decided to go out and give it a try, and I found that I absolutely loved it. It's a really fun way to fish. It's a really effective way to fish, and I've been at it not even a full year, so I would say I'm by no means an expert, but I've done it a fair amount, everywhere from the Nooksack and the Skagit to the Methow and the Yakima. And so I'm going to share a lot of what I've learned and picked up over the last year with you tonight. So let's start with, if I can get to the next screen. So what is Euro nymphing? Euro nymphing, if you spend much time on social media or reading fly fishing blogs and watching YouTube, you're bound to have heard of Euro nymphing. It's kind of, I would say in some respects, a current trend in fly fishing, but it's been around for a long time, and it's chances are you've probably done it in some way, shape, or form. Euro nymphing is basically an extension of tightline nymphing, high stick nymphing. It's synonymous with check nymphing, Polish nymphing. Essentially, nearly every country in Europe has its own sort of subgenre of Euro nymphing, and it's really caught on. At some point, maybe we'll even have like an American nymphing counterpart, but it goes by a lot of different names, but I'll explain in more depth what it is. So first, though, I'm going to talk about why you might want a Euro nymph. I think a lot of us who fly fish kind of epitomize the sport in, presenting a dry fly to a rising trout or swinging a fly for steelhead. People have lots of different passions about how to catch the fish they love and pursue. So why pick up a new one? Why take on Euro nymphing? So first off, it's fun. I would not want to try to make you do anything that wasn't a good time or wasn't fun. So Euro nymphing is a pretty cool thing to check out. I recommend trying it at some point. It's something new to master. I think one of the reasons I've been able to be interested in fly fishing, to the point of owning a fly shop over 35 years is you never reach a point where you know everything there is to know. It doesn't really get boring. And so this is a new kind of learning activity to take on. It'll enhance your understanding of moving water. So what we see when we go to the river, sorry, I got a phone ringing in the background at the shop here. What we see when we go to the river is the current on the surface, and we're able to assess the speed of the water. And I find, me personally, I often walk by a lot of water thinking I can't really present a fly there, or that's moving too fast. Euro nymphing is a way to help understand what's going on below those faster surface currents. you will find trout all throughout a river, and in a lot of water you would have normally bypassed with your dry fly because you couldn't get the right presentation, or even fishing with an indicator. It's eye-opening. I often thought certain stretches of river were relatively sparsely populated with trout. You know, I'd go in and I'd fish a run, I'd catch 2 or 3 fish, and then kind of move on to the next run. Euro nymphing, I found you can often stay on a piece of water and you just keep catching fish, and it's a wake-up call as to how many fish might actually be occupying a stretch of water. And then it's highly effective. I mean, if you want to go out and sample a stream and see what's there and just catch a lot of fish, small, medium, and big, I don't know that there's a more effective way to just catch fish with a fly rod. So let's talk about how Euro nymphing is different from what you may already know in fly fishing. So if you've ever nymphed, chances are you've done it with a strike indicator. That's been very popular for a long time, especially in the United States. So Euro nymphing, you don't use an indicator or a bobber, as I like to call them. Let's be honest, it's a bobber. All right. It utilizes a special leader. So your leader construction is a little bit different than what you would conventionally use as far as a tapered leader. And I'll get more into the specifics of that in a bit here. Your fly line is largely irrelevant. One of the things that makes Euro nymphing different than regular fly fishing is that you're not relying on the weight of your fly line to load your rod and make it bend. You're actually relying on the weight of the flies. And we'll talk about what makes that work when we get to equipment, and talking about how the actions of Euro nymphing rods are different than what you might be used to with a regular fly rod. So fly line doesn't really get used. Oops, having some PowerPoint issues here. There we go. You also see a lot of specialized flies for Euro nymphing. Most Euro nymphing flies, and I'll show you some pictures in a bit, are tied on a jig style hook, and that's designed to make the fly right upside down. With Euro nymphing, you're often kind of bouncing your flies right along the bottom of the stream, where you're apt to get snagged up on rocks or sticks. So having a fly that rides hook point up is definitely beneficial in that case. But it's not at all a requirement of Euro nymphing. You could certainly Euro nymph with any old fly that's designed to sink. So let's talk about some of the real advantages of Euro nymphing, because there definitely are a number of them over the way a lot of us are used to nymphing with an indicator. So first and foremost, I think you get a better presentation. I talked about earlier sort of the disparity between what's going on the surface of a river or stream and what's happening underneath. So oftentimes we get to a run and the water looks really fast, and you think to yourself, how is a trout or any kind of fish going to be comfortable fighting the current and trying to feed? But when we get below the surface and we look at the bottom substrate, the makeup of larger rock and sort of pits and depressions and places where fish can seek refuge from the current, it's nice and hospitable to trout down toward the river bottom. And Euro nymphing is going to give you a much better presentation, because if you've got a bobber, or even if you're fishing a dry fly, oftentimes that presentation is going to get swept out of position really quickly by the faster surface current. With a Euro nymph, you don't have to worry about those fast currents on the surface. And then it's more adaptive. One of the limitations of indicator style nymphing is that you kind of have to make a decision up front about the depth you're fishing. So if I've got my fly set 3 or 4 feet below my strike indicator, the run I'm fishing might not be uniformly 3 to 4 feet deep. It might have some deep spots. It might have some shallow spots. And with an indicator, I might be in a situation where my fly is either hanging up because I've got that indicator set too high up, or I might have a situation where I'm not even close to the bottom because my fly just drifted over a shelf and then it's another couple feet deeper. With Euro nymphing, you can actually fish any depth on the same presentation. So, you know, I can start out at the top of a riffle. I can set my flies up to drift, you know, a foot or two under the surface right along the bottom. And then I can lower my rod or raise my rod to adjust the depth of those flies, all without having to move an indicator along my line. So it's much more adaptive. And then I think all in all, once you get your leader set up, it's a lot less junk to mess with. You're not having to attach and reposition strike indicators. You're not having to attach split shot or make a lot of adjustments to things as you go. So it's, I think at the heart of it, Euro nymphing is really simple and basic. Anybody can do it. So as with anything, there are some limitations in Euro nymphing many of which I kind of found the hard way. It's fairly limited to close range because you're relying on casting the weight of just a couple of flies, maybe designed with tungsten beads. This isn't something that you can expect to cast super far. I would say most of the time you're going to be working water within 10 to 20 feet of you. If you want to work farther out, it's a matter of wading deeper to get closer to your target. Whereas I can present flies from a much greater distance under an indicator or fishing a dry. Wind is a factor. If you thought casting a fly line on a 6-weight during a stiff breeze over on the Yakima River is a challenge, take a 3-weight Euro nymphing rod out with a really light setup and try to make that happen in the wind. It's absolutely awful. Wind is bad for Euro nymphing. And then the tangles can be bad too, because when I talk about a Euro nymphing leader, we're often fishing leaders, you know, that might go as long as 20, 25 feet. That's a lot of thin diameter stuff. If something goes wrong and your flies get wrapped up, untangling a 25-foot leader where, you know, half of it might be 4 or 5x diameter tippet is a lot harder than untangling a fly line or something relatively short. So avoid those tangles when you can. So equipment considerations. And before I get into this, I want to say you can essentially Euro nymph with anything. There are some advantages to certain types of equipment that are designed specifically for the purpose of Euro nymphing. But if you've got, you know, your trusty old 9-foot 5-weight fly rod and you want to dabble in Euro nymphing, there's absolutely no reason you can't do that. You don't. I know this seems the opposite of what you'd expect from a fly shop owner, but you don't have to run out and buy a new piece of equipment to make this happen. So Euro nymphing rods are pretty typically ranging in the 2 to 4 weight ranges. Meaning they're relatively light. You don't see a lot of, you know, 6 to 8 weight Euro nymphing rods out there on the market. They tend to be a little longer too. Most are 10 to 11 feet long. Part of the reason for the lightness of the rod is so that you can get a rod that's light enough to load under just the weight of the fly for casting a fly or two, or sometimes up to 3 flies on a long leader. if you tried to do that on a 8-weight, you know, you'd probably need to try casting a 1/4 ounce jig or a slinky or something obnoxiously heavy, and then it gets to be a little ridiculous. Euro nymphing rods typically have a fairly soft tip section to them too, which both aids in casting the flies and gives you a little bit more sensitivity in terms of being able to feel as that nymph or pair of nymphs is tapping the rocks along its drift, or you know, when a fish actually stops and eats one of them. So 2 to 4 weight rods. I would say if I were going to pick one, a 10-foot 3-weight is really hard to beat for all around use. I've Euro nymphed with that rod everywhere from the Skagit to you know, small river, creek, you know, stuff like the Chewuk over in the Winthrop area. It'll get a lot done. If I were really going to get into it and, you know, find myself fishing a lot of big rivers and wanting to Euro nymph, like spending a lot of time on the Skagit down here in the States, an 11-footer might be nice. But most of the time that 3-weight's heavy enough to handle, you know, fish in the 20+ inch range. I would not want to hook a steelhead or certainly like a chum salmon or anything on that setup, but it'll handle some pretty good sized fish. So a large arbor reel is nice, not only because you can pick up line faster when you're reeling in fish, but because your leader is so long and consists of various forms of monofilament. Monofilament's got a lot of memory. If you're winding it around a larger diameter surface, it's not going to get as coily on you. And then a light level line. So the sort of the backstory on a Euro nymphing fly line, because you'll see most major line manufacturers now offer some kind of Euro nymphing line. It's basically the equivalent of a 2 to 3 weight running line. There's no taper to it. It's completely level. I mentioned earlier that the fly line is obsolete, and it really is. It doesn't factor into the equation when you're fishing. It's mainly something to hang on to in your hand. If you're used to managing fly line or stripping fly line when you're playing a fish, it's a lot more comfortable. But I've seen people use anything from Berkeley big game on a reel to just Dacron backing. I choose to use just one of the Euro nymphing lines, or if you've got an old fly line and want to go on the cheap, just cut the running line off, the untapered portion of the line, and that makes a fantastic Euro nymphing line. And then the Euro leader, which is really one of the single most important parts of the whole system here. So I'm going to talk about what I construct my Euro nymphing leader out of here. And if you go on to YouTube or any internet searches, you'll find a variety of different leader formulas, but this is the one that I've decided I like the best. And if you don't want to make your own, Rio, Scientific Anglers, they all make pre-constructed Euro nymphing leaders. And the nice thing about them, the way they're made, you can essentially use the majority of your leader will last you all season. You never have to change it. You're basically just going to be adding or removing tippet to accommodate whatever situation you're in. So I make my Euro leader with kind of the following formula. My butt section or long section is 15 feet of 20-pound Maxima chameleon. I like the chameleon because it's relatively stiff and it's relatively memory free as well. And it's durable as heck. It never seems to wear out. I then have a short transition section, about a foot of, I started out using Maxima Ultra Green. I've since gone to 15-pound Sunset Amnesia. P line or any kind of a colored monofilament would work well. It just makes the leader a little bit easier to see. And then I do 1 to 2 feet of Rio makes a 2-tone indicator material. So it's pink and chartreuse. And that's used as your cider, basically your indicator. And when I say indicator, it's not really being used in the same way that that a strike indicator or a bobber would be. It's not designed to suspend your fly. I find the better I've gotten at Euro nymphing, I'm not even really using it to detect strikes. I'm using that brightly colored, highly visible section of that leader to sort of track my drift and keep track of where my flies are. Most of the time when I get a fish, I'm actually feeling it, because if there's a tight line between the tip of my rod and the fly or flies that I'm fishing, I'm going to feel it when the fish either just stops the fly or hits it really hard. Off the end of that short indicator section there, I tie a tippet ring. And a tippet ring is just a round, like 2 or 3 millimeter stainless steel ring. The importance of that is that's what preserves everything else. When you've got that little ring on there, which I just attached to the indicator with a improved clinch knot, that means every time you add more tippet or you change flies and things like that, that whole back section of the leader is not something you're going to have to cut into and eventually replace. So that stays a consistent length. And then for my tippet, typically using 4 to 6X fluorocarbon. I like the fluorocarbon not only because it's less visible to fish, but it tends to sink more efficiently than monofilament. And sinking and allowing those flies to get down is really critical in Euro nymphing. So let's talk about the flies we use here. And there's a couple of terms that you'll hear a lot with Euro nymphing. In fact, some fly companies and catalogs actually have their flies divided into these categories. You have anchor flies and dropper flies. And your anchor fly is essentially the heavy fly that's designed to get the whole system down. So my anchor fly, I'm not all that concerned necessarily with matching the hatch. It tends to be a general attractor, kind of a bigger, meaty fly. But the fly is big enough to allow me to use maybe a 4 or a 3.5 millimeter tungsten bead, some lead-free wire underneath, something to help get me down to the bottom or anchor the system. And most of the time, the flies pictured are 5 of my favorites. Most of them, might resemble a stonefly nymph or a crane fly larva. The pink squirmy wormy, I have no idea what that's intended to represent, but it works like gangbusters. These flies all catch a lot of fish in their own right. This time of year, I would say one fly I would add to that list would be some sort of an egg pattern. There's a fly called a slush egg that we're often fishing this time of year. You've got a lot of salmon spawning and a lot of eggs in the water. And then my dropper flies are my smaller flies. So size-wise, my anchor flies might range from size 8 up to size 12. My dropper flies tend to be quite a bit smaller, 12s, 14s, 16s. And the dropper flies, you'll notice I've got several variations of the Frenchie. The Frenchie is a pheasant tail nymph variation. It's actually easier to tie than the original pheasant tail nymph. It was a pattern developed several years ago by Lance Egan, who's a competitive, like on the US competitive fly fishing team. Very simple pattern, catches the heck out of fish. If I could have only one fly to fish all the time, I would just fish a Frenchie. It was the first fly I ever caught a fish on Euro nymphing, and it hasn't stopped working since then. But you've got Frenchies, Perdigon style nymphs are very thin, hydrodynamic. They sink very efficiently. I fish a lot of those too, but these tend to be smaller, and they might represent something like a pale morning dun or Baetis nymph. And oftentimes the fish that aren't taking the bigger fly will opt for something smaller. So most of the time Euro nymphing, I'm fishing 2 to 3 flies. Usually I limit it to 2. Something else that's kind of unique about Euro nymphing flies, and this is a trend that's sort of bled over into a lot of different fly styles, but incorporating hot spots into the fly, kind of a visual target that draws the fish's attention to your fly over, you know, all the naturals it might be seeing come by. So a hot spot is just a small fluorescent or UV reactive kind of tag or collar on the fly that helps fish to notice it. And those can be made with fluorescent thread, a fluorescent bead. I've got some flies here under a UV light, so you can kind of see what portion of the fly pops. And sometimes it's more of the fly than others. But those are something I incorporate into my Euro nymphing patterns a lot. And then now let's just kind of talk about the gist of Euro nymphing. Essentially, all you're doing is lobbing your flies upstream, tracking the drift with your rod tip, and then when they get below you to the point where they're under tension and they're not going to drift any further, you just you repeat the process. So just like fishing dry flies or fishing indicator nymphing tactics, I like to work my way upstream. I think this is just generally a more tactical approach. If you're moving up below the fish and gradually working your way up a run, the fish are less likely to see you. Now, this is always my recommendation. That being said, there are times when I just happen to be on my way downstream or you know, I can't go upstream because there's an impassable canyon or something. So it certainly works downstream, but if given the option, I'll prefer to work my way upstream. And then I like to start short. One of the things that has just absolutely amazed me that I did not care to notice before Euro nymphing is the number of fish that are literally right at your feet. I've caught fish sometimes a foot away from me. Fish are often very, very close. They're not all on the other side of the river. I think many of us have this tendency to look at the far bank and think, oh, I want to get that right bank feeder under the trees, or I want to hit that juicy spot way over there. Don't forget to fish the water right at your feet. Start short. Don't wade out super deep. I sometimes find myself backing up so that I can fish shallower because I'm getting fish so close to me. And then you're going to cover the slots within a range. So you're going to work the section within a few feet of you. You'll work a few feet farther out and then you go as far as you can comfortably. And then once you've covered those slots in one presentation, you'll walk upstream and then do the same presentation. It's a little bit like swinging flies for steelhead, where you work a fixed length of the line and swing it across the stream, and then you take a couple steps downstream. And in so doing, you're kind of gridding out a piece of water and making sure you cover as much of it as possible. And you'll be amazed sometimes by how many fish you can catch in a relatively small piece of water, Euro nymphing. One of the ways I've always preferred to fish, especially in Western Washington, I like doing a lot of streamer fishing. If I'm not streamer fishing, I like to fish a, big, visible, easy to track fly like a chubby Chernobyl. And in doing that, I find myself covering a lot of water quickly and sometimes walking miles over the course of the day. Because really, when I'm employing those methods, I'm relying on the inherent aggressiveness of a fish to take those presentations. Not every fish in the run is going to eat a Scopezilla. Not every fish in the run is going to come up and slurp a purple chubby Chernobyl drifted over it. That's just reality. I find Euro nymphing, sometimes it feels like you could literally catch just about every fish in the run. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, just from a conservation standpoint. But yeah, it's a relatively simple method once you get it down. So some of the key observations, and these were a lot of my big takeaways from learning how to Euro nymph, and the things that really matter and make the difference between catching fish and not catching fish. So fly weight matters. You need your flies to ideally be bouncing right along the bottom. And if you don't have enough weight, you're going to notice a big downstream facing bow in your line as your flies get swept down in the fast current. If your flies are too heavy, you're going to notice you make your cast and they just kind of hang up and drag on the bottom and don't drift toward you. If it's just right, you'll make your cast, your flies will sink, and you'll feel a nice gentle tap, tap, tap as those flies are bouncing along the bottom. And you'll feel kind of everything that happens, including the strike of a fish. So when I organize my flies in my Euro nymphing box, I'm not necessarily doing it by pattern. I'm doing it more by weight. All of the flies with a 4mm tungsten bead go in one section. All of them with a 3mm and a 2.5mm go in another. So I can easily look in there and identify, this is the combination I think I need. Maybe I want a 3.5 mil for my anchor fly. Maybe I want a 2.5mm for my dropper fly, and that's going to get me in the zone. Aside from the weight of the fly, because you can keep stacking weight and go heavier and heavier and heavier, but another option I think is a little bit more enjoyable to fish, and that is considering your tippet diameter. So if you look at 3x tippet and 5x tippet, they look pretty similar. 3x is going to, of course, be a lot stronger. There's a huge difference in how efficiently 5x tippet sinks versus 4x tippet. A lot of times, I found this on the Yakima in June when it's flooded for irrigation and the water is just ripping through there. You're going to find you just can't get down no matter what you put on. And you can go heavier and heavier, and it doesn't make a difference. If you drop down your tippet size, even going as light as 6x, your flies are going to sink a lot better. All in all, I found particular fly pattern doesn't really matter. I think looking at it in broader strokes, I think sometimes the fish want a bigger fly, sometimes they want a smaller fly. But if I was fishing a hollow Frenchie versus a CDC flashback pheasant tail, it didn't seem to make a difference. A lot of times I'd be out fishing with a friend. They had something completely different than me, and we're still catching fish as long as we're putting our flies in the zone. So don't put too much thought into having a specific pattern. And then lastly, use that cider to manage depth. I initially thought the cider section, the brightly colored section of my Euro nymphing leader was, kind of taking the place as a strike indicator. And I found Where it's really handy is to be able to tell where that sighter is relative to the surface of the water. That's going to give me a sense of how deep I'm fishing. So if I know my leader below it is 8 feet deep or 8 feet long, and I'm fishing water that's, let's say, 3 feet deep, I'm going to want to have that sighter about 5 feet above the surface of the water, and then I'll know where my fly is in the zone. I'm not that great at math, but I think that worked out. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. And then let's talk for a moment just about conservation considerations, because after all, TU is a conservation organization, and I think this is really important to touch on. So fish handling, of course, is really important, especially if you're handling a lot of fish. We want them to live. Release them gently. Keep your fish in the water. Use a knotless rubber net. Don't handle the fish with gloves on. Get yourself a good underwater camera. You could take pictures like this. This was actually a kind of a selfie. I never know if these are going to turn out or not, but once in a while you get a good one. First dibs. I've got some friends that are just as into Euro nymphing as I am. I have others that want to fish the way they want to fish. I feel like because Euro nymphing is a pretty effective tactic, if my buddy's fishing a streamer or fishing dries, I'll let them go through the run first, because I know there's a high probability I'll be able to catch a number of fish behind them. Whereas, if I get right in there and hog the water to myself, I might catch fish that the aggressive fish they would have had an opportunity to catch on another method. So that's just my thoughts on that matter. And then most importantly, no one to quit. I think, just because you can catch a lot of fish doesn't necessarily mean you should. And even though I think we often pride ourselves as catch and release anglers, you got to understand that there's a mortality associated with handling and releasing fish. If I catch 100 fish in a day, there's a few of those that probably might not make it. I don't like to think about that, but at some point you got to decide for yourself, like, when have I caught enough fish? Does it have to be every fish in the river? Does it have to be every fish in the run? I think oftentimes, I can go out, get a few fish, feel pretty good about it, and then kind of move on to enjoying other things like the sites along the river, or just change locations, move on to a different piece of water. Don't hammer the same run all afternoon just because you can. So questions, and we have a little caveat here, except for Brandon Sly, because Brandon tested out a number of questions on me at the shop earlier today, and I didn't think they were suitable for public consumption.
Sure, we'll just keep him on mute. So Craig had some questions in the chat, and I don't, at the risk of butchering it, Craig, do you want to unmute yourself and elaborate on your question for Scott? It's a good one.
Scott, can you see it?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, let me see if I can find the chat here. I am a Zoom.
Hey, we're patient.
But I think I just found it.
All right, we're patient.
So for anybody not looking at the chat, I'll read the question. So did you have any experiences living in France that conjure up this sense of Euro in terms of tactics? Any comments on how the tactic was dubbed? How do you recall the faster sections of Rocky Ford from your youth? sections below the lower bridge and how that might intersect with Euro nymphing or Euro nymphing with, say, a 4-weight. So it's kind of a drawn out question. There's some history there, and I don't blame Bridget for not wanting to tackle that one, but I'll do my best to answer. So I lived in France for a little bit when I was a teenager, got to fly fish there. It was pretty cool catching native brown trout within their natural range. At that point, I really didn't see I didn't see a lot of other people fishing. I certainly didn't see people fishing in a style that I would necessarily equate with Euro nymphing. I did get an opportunity to see a number of rivers, like in the Pyrenees, where kind of modern Euro nymphing took hold and was born. And I can understand, I mean, one of the advantages of Euro nymphing is if you're fishing like an exceptionally clear mountain stream that gets a fair amount of pressure, fish are incredibly wary. And, if you lob a giant thingamabobber and some split shot in there, like you're going to send every trout in the vicinity, just scattered out of the pool. With Euro nymphing, it's a lot more subtle. It's a quieter presentation, and I can understand why people employ that tactic to catch fish in places like that. When I was a kid, Craig's an old college roommate. We used to go over to Rocky Ford once or twice a year and fish. For those of you that haven't fished Rocky Ford, it's a spring creek in eastern Washington, kind of known for somewhat selective, spooky fish. And we found if you get down below the real slow kind of pondy areas where the fish get an opportunity to get a good hard look at what you're fishing, and you get down into kind of the tail races where you've got fast water and fish hanging out in there, they got to make a split second decision to take your fly or let it go by. And so we actually sometimes fished pretty ridiculous stuff in there. I think one time we did fantastic, just high sticking a big rubber-legged bitch creek nymph through there, which is an absurd fly to be fishing on a spring creek, but it worked. So I hope that answers that. And yeah, it's there's just a question below it. It seems very similar to high stick nymphing. It's exactly high stick nymphing. It's not just similar. It's you are essentially high stick nymphing. I would say the difference from the high stick nymphing that I grew up with, where you just fished your standard 9-foot tapered leader down to 4X or 5X and just kind of ran it through a slot or a piece of pocket water. There's a little bit more to the leader construction and the design of the flies to aid in getting that fly down deep. So.
Nice. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
2 more questions in the chat. Stolzenberg asks, could you or have you used these tactics and leaders for steelhead? I think I heard you say that you would not, but I'll let you elaborate on that.
I don't know if I said it in the presentation. I'm sure I've said it. I've said it elsewhere many a time. I'm not judging anybody for fishing how they want to fish. I prefer not to nymph, whether it's Euro nymphing or indicator nymphing for steelhead, simply because I think especially nowadays where, we're facing, potential coast-wide closures and things like that because of the status of our fish. I just think it's potentially too effective. I think steelheading should be hard. I choose to swing a fly for steelhead. I want to make the fish have to make a decision to take that fly, and I know it's not going to. I'm not going to catch there's a lot of fish that just aren't going to do it. It's going to limit the number of fish I catch. And for me personally, that makes it special. And I think it's better on the fishery. So
that's a no on the triple bead rig.
That's a no on the triple bead rig.
Joe is wondering if there are any seasonal considerations. Can you do the winter on an open river?
Yeah, I think Euro nymphing is definitely a year-round venture. In fact, I think it's going to be one of the more effective tactics in winter. Fish being cold-blooded, cold water, slow metabolism means they're often not going to move very far to eat, which means the closer you can put your fly to where the fish are, the more fish you're going to catch. It's not quite officially winter yet, but I've been spending a lot of time out on the North Fork of the Nooksack over the last several weeks, really targeting whitefish and occasionally catching a bull trout. It's something to do. It's a fun change up from fishing for salmon and steelhead. A lot of people overlook the fact that the Nooksack, the Skagit have huge populations of whitefish, and I'll qualify that. That's not to say the whitefish are huge, but the populations are. But on a 10-foot 3-weight, going out and catching a bunch of whitefish in the warm part of the afternoon, pretty fun way to spend the day in my book, and Euro nymphing works fantastic for them.
I can attest to the presence of whitefish in the Nooksack.
Yeah.
Any other questions? You don't have to type them in the chat if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Scott your question, as long as your name is not Brandon Sly.
Yeah. I do have a question from Chris Van Staldenen.
Yeah, I'm ignoring that one.
Asking if I like gladiator movies. I don't know. The jury's undecided on that one.
Scott, I had a question for you. You might have answered this, but and I'd stepped out for a moment. How deep water can you effectively target fish in?
I've gone as deep as 8-9 feet, which I think is a lot deeper than you would typically see me trying to fish with an indicator. I think in theory you could fish deeper than you can with an indicator. Problem with an indicator is, most of them are big enough, they're not going to fit through the tip top of your fly rod. And so if you fish 20 feet under a strike indicator, when you hook a fish, you're going to reel that indicator up to the tip of the rod, and the fish is still going to be quite some distance away from you. And so with Euro nymphing, because you don't have all those extras on there, I mean, even like the small tippet ring will go through your rod guides without any issues whatsoever. So I think you could fish fairly deep with it. I've not been in a situation where I think I needed to go much deeper than 8-9 feet.
Brandon Sly says, in all seriousness, Tate, I got a nice whitefish, probably 12 to 15 feet deep in a back eddy. So there you go. Any more questions for Scott?
I had one other for you too. You're talking about converting a old fly line, and you said cut off the running line portion. Are you saying to use that running line, or throw the running line away and use the head?
No, use the running line. What you don't want is a lot of taper or a larger diameter fly line around the tip of the rod, because there is a little bit more mass and weight to it. It can affect the way your Euro nymphing rod casts. It can make it feel kind of tip heavy too. I think balancing your system with the right amount of weight to the rod and the reel is important, because you're often going to be up above your head in this high position. If you have a rod that feels really heavy and droopy at the tip, it's going to kind of force your wrist down, and it doesn't seem like much, but over the course of doing that all day long, you're going to go home with a sore arm. And so just using something thin diameter, I like eliminating as many of the potential hang-up connections as well. So most Euro nymphing lines, and most fly lines for that matter, come with a welded factory loop in the end. I still like using those much of the time on other setups, but for Euro nymphing, I cut the loop off the Euro nymphing line, and then I just nail knot my whole leader to the end of it. So it's a pretty smooth transition going through the guides. But yeah, any old, I've got a million old lines that I don't use. So I'm pretty sure I got a lifetime supply of Euro nymphing lines if I ever manage to wear one out. So.
I was about to ask, what's the difference between Euro nymphing and Tenkara? But I think
I am no Tenkara expert, having never done it, but as far as I can see, like just the observations I've made on it, is Tenkara, you're fishing a fixed length of line, whereas Euro nymphing, that length can be variable. If you want to cast farther or fish deeper, you could strip some excess line off the reel. If you hook a big fish, and if you fish the Metau, we were finding some 21, 22-inch cut bows in there this summer. Those fish are going to take line and peel it off the reel. I don't know. I've heard if you're fishing a Tenkara rod, you're supposed to just throw the rod at the fish, kind of like a javelin, and then dragging the rod around for an hour is going to tire that fish out, and then you go get it. I think landing a fish on a Euro nymphing rod seems a lot more efficient. It's no different than playing a fish on any other type of fly rod. So.
Understandable. Anyone else got questions for Scott? I've gotten a few questions about sharing the recording, and yes, I am recording, and I will be putting this on our YouTube channel later, and then I'll post it on our Facebook page. So the link to the YouTube channel is in the chat, or you can follow us on Facebook. Thank you. You're welcome. I will try and do that tonight, but if I run into technical difficulties, it might not be till tomorrow. Jen says, thank you. This was a great introduction. I have to agree. I learned a lot about Euro nymphing. It reminded me that I have a lot to learn about a lot of different things. So this was great, Scott. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah. So again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in. The video will be posted to our YouTube channel, and then I've also put our email in at the beginning in case you have any more questions. But other than that, you are free to go.
Thanks. Merry Christmas.
Yes, have a great holiday season, everyone.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Good stuff.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Scott, have you ever doubled up on fish before?